I came home 4 days early from a fishing trip up in the mountains, the kind of trip my late wife Carol used to tease me about. 3 men, 2 coolers of beer, the baie, and not a single fish caught, she'd say, and she wasn't wrong. But my knees had been aching since the second morning, and Frank's cabin didn't have the kind of mattress a 64-year-old man's back could forgive, so I packed up my gear and drove the 6 hours home a day early, thinking about nothing more exciting than my own bed and a quiet cup of coffee on my back porch. I noticed the extra car before I even pulled into the driveway. A silver minivan I didn't recognize, parked crooked against the curb like whoever drove it hadn't cared enough to straighten it out. My son Danny's truck was in its usual spot. Beside it sat a U-Haul trailer, still hitched, back gate hanging open like a mouth, caught mid-yawn. I sat in my car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe Danny and his wife Renee were helping somebody move. Maybe it was nothing. I have learned, in 64 years on this earth, that the moment you tell yourself it's probably nothing is usually the moment right before you find out it's something. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and walked up the path I'd laid myself, flagstone by flagstone, the summer after Carol passed. Back when I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't grieving. The front door was unlocked. Wide open, in fact, propped with a cinder block I didn't recognize, like the house itself had been left to breathe out whatever secrets it was holding. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell of fried onions and something like mothballs layered over the lavender candles Carol used to burn, now buried under a decade of somebody else's habits in the span of what could only have been a single day. My living room, the one I'd repainted just that spring, the one with Carol's reading chair still positioned by the window where the afternoon light hit best, was unrecognizable. Boxes stacked 3 and 4 high, a folding card table where my coffee table used to be. 2 men I had never seen in my life were carrying a mattress frame through my hallway, grunting with the effort, paying me no more attention than they'd pay a stranger on the street because, as far as they knew, that's exactly what I was. "Excuse me," I said. Neither one looked up. I walked further in, my duffel bag still slung over my shoulder, my heart starting to do something uneven in my chest. I said, that's when I heard voices from the kitchen, and one of them was Renee's, laughing at something, easy and light, the way you laugh when you believe you've already won. I found my son standing at the kitchen counter, not doing anything, not helping, not stopping anyone, just standing there with his hands jammed in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the floor like he'd lost something down there and couldn't bring himself to look for it. He was 31 years old, married 3 years, a grown man with a job and a mortgage of his own that he'd let go underwater 2 years back. But standing in my kitchen at that moment, he looked exactly like he did the day he wrecked my first truck at 17 and had to tell me about it. "Danny," I said. His head snapped up, and I said it. His face went the color of old paper. "Dad? You're early." "I noticed," I said. "Somebody want to tell me why there are strangers carrying furniture through my house?" He opened his mouth, and before a single word came out, Renee walked in from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. And I want to tell you, the woman did not look surprised. She did not look caught. She looked at me the way you'd look at a delivery driver who showed up a few minutes ahead of schedule, mildly inconvenienced, nothing more. "Oh good, you're here," she said, like I'd been expected. "We were going to call you tonight and explain everything, but I guess this works too." "Explain what, exactly?" She glanced at Danny, who still hadn't found his voice, and she sighed the sigh of a woman burdened with having to do everyone's talking for them. "My dad lost his job in March. You know that. My mom's been having health problems, her hip. Remember I told you about her hip? And with rent where it is right now, it just made sense for them to stay here for a little while. Just until they land on their feet. It's not permanent, Robert. Nobody asked me," I said. "Danny said it would be fine." I turned to my son. "Did I give you permission to move your wife's entire family into my house?" He flinched like I'd raised a hand to him, which I never had, not once in his whole life, and he still couldn't meet my eyes. "Dad, it just kind of happened." Renee's dad showed up with a truck and I didn't know what to. "You didn't know what to say," I repeated. "In your own father's house." "It's temporary," Renee said again, sharper this time, like repetition alone might make it true. I walked past both of them, down the hall, past the boxes and the strangers still hauling furniture. And I opened the door to my bedroom, the one room in that house that had stayed exactly the way Carol left it, down to the cardigan still draped over the chair by the window because I never could bring myself to move it. The cardigan was gone. So was the chair. In its place sat two enormous suitcases, unzipped, spilling someone else's clothes onto my carpet. The nightstand where I kept Carol's reading glasses, the ones I couldn't throw away, had a stranger's phone charger plugged into the outlet where her lamp used to sit, her lamp now nowhere to be found. Renee's parents, apparently, had claimed my bedroom as their own, and in doing so, had erased the last physical traces of the only woman I had ever loved. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief, freshly excavated, as raw as the day I buried her. When I turned around, Renee's mother was standing in the hallway behind me. A heavy-set woman named Diane, whom I had met exactly twice, both times at holiday dinners where she'd complained about my cooking. She looked at me standing in the doorway of what was now, apparently, her bedroom, and she had the absolute nerve to look annoyed. "You must be Robert," she said. "We didn't think you'd be back so soon. We would have tidied up." "This is my room," I said. "My wife's things were in here. Well, we had to put them somewhere," Diane said, with a little shrug, as if Carol's 15 years of marriage, her cardigan, her glasses, her lamp, amounted to nothing more than clutter that needed clearing for the new tenants. "We boxed it all up. It's in the garage, I believe, or the shed. Danny would know." I did not raise my voice. I want that understood, because in the version of this story that got told later, by people who weren't there, I apparently screamed and threw things and behaved like a man come unglued. I did none of that. I simply turned around, walked back down the hallway, past the strangers, still hauling furniture through my house, past my son, who still would not look at me, and I said, "Everyone who does not have my last name needs to be out of this house within the hour." Renee laughed, not a nervous laugh, a real one, from the belly, like I'd told a genuinely good joke. "Robert, come on. Be reasonable. Where are they supposed to go? It's not like we can just—" "That is not my problem," I said. "This is my house. I bought it in 1994. I paid it off in 2019. My name is on the deed. And my name alone. My name alone. You have 1 hour. Danny," she said, turning to my son, "tell your father this is ridiculous." And my son, my only child, the boy I had raised alone for the better part of 8 years after Carol got sick, the boy I had coached in Little League and walked down the aisle at his own wedding, my son looked at his wife, looked at me, and said nothing at all. He just stood there, useless, the way a man stands when he's already decided the fight isn't worth having, not realizing that his silence was, in fact, the loudest answer he could have given. I walked out to my car. I sat behind the wheel with my hands shaking, not from fear, but from something colder and more deliberate settling into my bones. I did not drive away. I called my brother-in-law, Pete, who'd spent 30 years as a patrol officer before he retired, and I asked him one simple question. If I called the police right now, what would happen? "Depends," Pete said. "If they've been there less than a couple hours and haven't established residency, it's a straightforward trespass call. Cops show up, verify you're the owner, and everyone who isn't family gets escorted off the property. It's when people let it sit for days or weeks that it turns into a legal mess. You get the mail there, a lease, anything on paper, and now you're looking at an eviction process instead of a trespass call. Robert, don't let this sit. Call it in today." I sat in that car for another 10 minutes, watching through my own front window as strangers carried boxes through my living room, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the week after Carol's funeral, the sensation of watching my life get rearranged by other people while I stood by, powerless to stop it. I was not going to feel that way twice in one lifetime. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation calmly, clearly. I gave my address, my name, told them I was the sole owner and that unauthorized individuals had moved belongings into my home without my consent within the last several hours. The dispatcher told me 2 officers would be sent out. While I waited, I walked around to the side of the house, to the shed where Diane had mentioned Carol's things might be. I found them there, shoved carelessly between a lawnmower and a stack of paint cans, Carol's cardigan, folded but crushed under a box of someone else's kitchen supplies. Her reading glasses, thankfully unbroken, tossed into a grocery bag along with the framed photograph of the two of us on our wedding day, the glass cracked clean across her smiling face. I held that cracked photograph in my hands, and I felt the last of my hesitation burn away. The officers arrived 18 minutes later. Two of them, a younger one named Ruiz and an older one, gray at the temples, named Halloran, who had the tired, patient look of a man who'd done this exact kind of call more times than he could count. I showed them my driver's license with the address matching, and when Ruiz asked if I had proof of ownership handy, I pulled up the deed on my phone, which I'd had the good sense to photograph years ago and keep in a folder just in case. "This is straightforward," Halloran said, after a brief conversation with his partner. "Sir, we're going to go in, and anyone in that house who isn't on this deed or isn't your son is going to be asked to leave immediately. If they refuse, that becomes a trespassing charge." I walked in behind them, and I will tell you, there is a particular satisfaction in watching a woman who laughed in your face an hour earlier go pale at the sight of a badge. "What is this? How?" Renee said, backing up against the kitchen counter. "We haven't done anything wrong, ma'am. Is this your primary residence?" Halloran asked her. "We're staying here temporarily. My husband's father said it was fine." "That's not true," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I came home from a trip 4 hours ago and found strangers moving furniture into my house without my knowledge. My son did not have my permission. Nobody did." Halloran turned to Danny. "Sir, is this your father's house?" Danny's mouth opened. I watched him look at Renee, watched him look at her parents standing frozen in the hallway with a box of dishes between them, watched him look at me, and for one brief, suspended moment, I thought foolishly, the way a father always hopes right up until the very end that he might finally say something with a spine in it. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's his house." It wasn't the apology I wanted. It wasn't him standing up for me the way I'd stood up for him his whole life. But it was, at least, the truth, and in that house, that day, the truth was the only thing that mattered. Halloran didn't waste time. He informed Diane, her husband Walter, and Renee's brother, a 22-year-old kid named Tyler who had said maybe 4 words the entire time I'd been standing there, that they had 30 minutes to gather what belonged to them and vacate the premises, or they would be arrested for trespassing. Renee began to cry, the kind of crying that comes from anger rather than remorse, and she turned on Danny with a fury that told me everything about the actual balance of power in their marriage. "You said this would be fine," she hissed at him. "You said he wouldn't even notice for a week." There it was. Not a spontaneous emergency. A calculated bet that I would be gone longer, that by the time I returned the whole arrangement would be settled fact, immovable, backed by however many days of mail and boxes and comfortable routine it would take to make eviction complicated instead of simple. My son had not been ambushed by his wife's family crisis. He had planned this with her, banking on my absence, banking on my age, maybe even banking on the fact that a grieving widower living alone might not have the fight left in him to say no. He had been wrong about that. It took them 26 minutes, not 30, to load everything back into the U-Haul and the minivan. Nobody spoke to me on their way out except Walter, who muttered something about how families were supposed to help each other, as though the last 3 hours hadn't been an attempt to help themselves to my house rather than help anyone at all. Diane didn't even look at me. Tyler carried out the last box without once raising his eyes from his phone. Danny lingered on the porch after the others had gone, the U-Haul idling at the curb, Renee already sitting in the passenger seat with her arms crossed, staring straight ahead. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry. I didn't think it would go like this. How did you think it would go?" He didn't have an answer for that. He never did, not for the questions that actually mattered. "I need you to go," I said. "Not out of anger. I just need some time." He nodded, and something in his face told me he understood, at least partially, the size of what he'd done, not the logistics of moving strangers into a house, but the deeper betrayal underneath it, the calculation, the willingness to gamble away my trust for the sake of his wife's convenience. He got in the truck and drove off behind the U-Haul, and I stood on my own porch in the fading light of that afternoon, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from a fight you lost, but from a fight you shouldn't have had to have in the first place. I want to tell you the story ended there, with the house empty and quiet and mine again, and in a way, it did. But there was one more piece I didn't discover until 3 days later, when I finally worked up the nerve to go through the boxes still stacked in my garage. Boxes I hadn't had the emotional strength to unpack the day of the incident. Underneath a box labeled Kitchen Misc, I found a manila folder that didn't belong to me. Inside were photocopies my deed, my mortgage statement from years back, even a printout of my property's tax assessment pulled from the county website. And clipped to the front, a handwritten note in Renee's looping handwriting, a rough calculation of what the house would be worth if it were transferred into Danny's name, alongside a list of local elder law attorneys, 3 of them circled. I sat on the concrete floor of my garage for a long time with that folder in my lap, feeling the particular cold that comes from realizing a plan had a second phase you weren't meant to see. This was never just about a place to stay. This was reconnaissance. This was Renee doing her homework on how, exactly, a house might eventually be pried out of an aging widower's hands through guardianship, through incapacity claims, through whatever legal machinery people use when they've decided patience is a virtue only for suckers. I called Pete again that night and told him what I'd found. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Robert, I want you to call an elder law attorney yourself, today or tomorrow at the latest. Not because anything's happened yet, but because you want to be the one who's prepared, not the one who's caught flat-footed." I took his advice. End quote. I met with an attorney named Miriam Castellano the following week, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who looked at the folder I'd found and told me, plainly, that what I was looking at was the early groundwork for a scheme that plays out more often than people realize: families moving in under the guise of temporary need, establishing a foothold, and slowly maneuvering toward control of a property, sometimes through guardianship petitions built on manufactured claims about an elderly parent's competence. She helped me draft an updated will, ironclad and specific, and she helped me send a formal, documented letter to Danny and Renee making it unambiguously clear in writing that I was of sound mind, sound judgment, and sole legal ownership of my home, and that any future attempt to establish residency without my written consent would result in immediate legal action. I never heard from Renee again after that letter went out, and Danny called twice in the following month. The first call, I let go to voicemail. The second, I answered, and we talked for a while, carefully, like 2 men picking their way across ice they weren't sure would hold. He told me he and Renee were struggling, that her family situation had put a strain on things that predated any of this, that he was seeing a counselor on his own now, trying to understand why he'd let things get as far as they had. I told him I was glad he was talking to someone. I told him I loved him, because I did, because that hadn't changed even though something else fundamental between us had. But I also told him that until he could look me in the eye and take responsibility for his own choices instead of standing silently by while someone else made them for him, there wasn't much more for us to talk about. He said he understood. I don't know if he really did. Sometimes understanding takes longer than a single phone call, longer than a single betrayal, sometimes longer than a father has left to wait. In the weeks after, I did what I probably should have done years earlier. I had the locks changed, not out of fear, but out of a kind of self-respect I'd let slip since Carol passed. The sense that a man's home is supposed to be the one place in the world where he doesn't have to brace himself for an invasion. I unpacked the boxes from the garage myself, slowly, on quiet evenings, and I found Carol's cardigan and had it cleaned, and I hung it back in the closet where it belonged, not on display, just present, the way she was always present in that house, whether anyone else respected it or not. I reframed the wedding photo, cracked glass and all, because somehow the crack felt honest now, a record of what the day had actually cost. Even if the picture inside it still showed 2 people who had no idea what was coming 30 years down the road, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I think about that day often, mostly not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clarity I didn't have before it happened. I had spent years operating under the quiet assumption that family meant automatic trust, that blood and marriage certificates were enough to guarantee someone wouldn't try to take advantage of you the moment your back was turned. I know better now. That's where trust isn't something you owe people simply because of how they're related to you. It's something people earn through their actions, and it's something they can lose in a single afternoon, the way Danny lost mine, standing silent in my kitchen while his wife's family carried my late wife's belongings out to a shed like garbage. I still love my son. That love didn't die in that hallway, and I don't think it ever will, not completely. But love and trust turned out to be 2 very different things, sitting in 2 very different rooms of my heart, and only one of those rooms still has an open door. I sit on my porch most evenings now, in Carol's old chair, which I moved back to its rightful place by the window the very same week I got my house back. I watch the sun go down over the same street I've lived on for 30 years, and I think about how close I came to losing all of it, not just the walls and the furniture, but the very last physical pieces of a woman I loved for 3 decades, nearly boxed up and discarded by people who saw an empty bedroom and mistook it for an opportunity. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about a lot of things. But mostly, they were wrong to believe that just because a man is over 60 and grieving and living alone, he no longer has the will or the right to stand in his own doorway and say, "Not this house, not while I'm still breathing, and not ever again."